say what the word communication meant. Okay, or actually no, even better, sociological. So if I was reading through normally, I just read through. I wouldn't even pay attention to this word. I just read over it, all right, and get to the end. Now, if the question said, what is the definition of the word sociological when used in the text, I'd have to go through and find it again. So you want questions like that are very simple and in terms of very specific and they're pointing towards one thing. You want to have those in your mind a little bit when you're reading through. So only very specific questions. Anything that's kind of better to answer once you've read the whole text, just leave it, right? So so for instance, this is very specific and easy to answer. It's just a very one-word answer. So how do players in esports refer to themselves? I'm going to be thinking about that when I read through. How do they refer to themselves? Okay, so then I'm looking at similarities. I'm looking at arguments against esports as real sports. Again, these ones are a little bit more detailed. I might focus a bit on it in the text, but I'm not going to really try and memorize 8 different questions. But, the thing is arguments for and against seems to be important, okay? Again, this should just be a quick scan through. So I'm looking for similarities, arguments for and against. How do they compare? This one's probably better to go overall, to be honest, after I've read the whole text. This one also looks a bit complicated. I'll leave that to the end. Purpose of the text, always leave to the end. And what form of the text? Well, I'll be thinking about what form the text is. Already, it doesn't really seem like a narrative. Doesn't really seem like descriptive. Okay, because it's not like it's not like a story. It's kind of like an article. So it's probably going to be either persuasive or informative. But we'll see. So let's get into the text now. So again, don't spend too long. Maybe take away 1 or 2 things from the questions that you can kind of look at or look for when you're reading through. So that way, once you've read through the text once, you then have the answers to a couple questions maybe. Okay, so people already talk about esport as a specific kind of athletic competition, even though the question of whether or not it can be called a sport in the narrower sense is far from settled. So it suggests that there's a little bit of both sides. Just like our questions ask us to find the arguments for and against, there might be a little bit of back and forth, a bit of a discussion almost. So when we look at how esports are played, it's not that easy to tell them apart from traditional sports. First, people who do esports call themselves sportsmen. Okay, so that's our answer, one answer already done. There's a chance that if we didn't read that question, we might have skimmed over that and had to check. Now we've got that question solidified, and we can just tick that off and don't worry about it at all. Also, all of the esports we've talked about are basically competitive settings where teams or players fight for victory, which is decided by a point system. Okay, so just in terms of the arguments for, remember there was a question about what are the arguments for recognizing, right? We could say something on the lines of, okay, well, it's competitive. Only within these rules can action be changed. Recently, some esports researchers focus on how professional esports and traditional sports are similar and different. Elite esports athletes have to be able to pay close attention for long periods of time and make important decisions quickly. So this is some kind of thing about esports, like a positive. This shows how esports and traditional sports are similar on a psychological level. Okay, so it seems like these are kind of the aspects for. These are the arguments for, all right? Esports being considered traditional sports. So to do well in an esports game, you need to have good motor skills, especially with your hands and fingers, as well as good eye-hand coordination and endurance. Again, more kind of positives for this. So I always suggest underlining main points that you find are you're going to use in the questions. So these are all the main points of arguments for. So to do well in esports, you need to be able to see and act in ways that are unique to the game. These skills are closely tied to your physical coordination skills when you take action. Systematic esports training, like training for traditional sports, helps improve motor and cognitive skills that are important to the game. Okay, so again, it's going through this idea of training your skills that are important to the game. Now, esports competitions are also won or lost based on how well the players know how to play the game. Last but not least, the actions of the game can be seen to make players burn more calories. Okay, well there you go. That's just burning calories. It's it's definitely using all your different skills. So okay, I think those kind of arguments here have definitely been going through all the positive things about esports. Okay? Now, by definition, esports competitions take place in virtual spaces, and the actions of the players are shown by avatars that the players control. Okay, So movements that are done while using the game console and movements that are done with the help of a computer are inseparable. Okay. So you can see here, there's like, so the movements, but the player's physical movements and the actual action of the game take place in different worlds, or so to speak, in an analog world and a virtual world. So, you're making some, movements on a controller or on like a keyboard and mouse, and that's being replicated on the screen, right? If anyone's ever, played a video game before, you guys might know that, if you move, like let's say you're moving a character, you move the joysticks or your mouse, and it's instantly moving. It's like you're right there immersed in the game. However, what you see in the inside world of the game is very, very different, right? So it takes place in very different worlds. So when people talk about whether or not sports organizations should recognize esports as real sports, this is often brought up as a reason why they shouldn't. So from a sociological point of view, so again, I mentioned the word sociological. It's a bit of a tricky vocab word, but let's think about what that means. So if you look in the word sociological, what other word do you see? You might see, if you look at that closely, that it looks like the word social at the front. And social kind of means like, like if you're being very social, you're like hanging out with friends, you're with other people, like, or society is talking about kind of like, the people in our world, in our city, and how they kind of like, interact. Okay? So sociological is all about society. So how society works. So if it's from a sociological point of view, it's the idea of like thinking about it in terms of how it affects society. How it affects all the people around us. Okay? So this argument could be refuted by the fact that many social interactions in modern society have been happening in virtual worlds for a long time. A big part of how people talk to each other every day is through electronic communication media, like social networks and instant messaging services. Okay, so here, right, the argument that sets them apart from real sports, right, why they shouldn't, is that the events take place in different worlds. You're learning something, or you're participating in something that doesn't happen in the real world. Okay, because it's happening in like actual like virtual world, they're saying it shouldn't be considered real sport. So again, this is one of our reasons against. All right, so we can actually use this for that answer. So a big part of how people talk, like we said, messaging services, communication services that are mediated by technology make it harder for people to talk and understand each other at the same time, which is important for analog communication. People can read and reply to messages whenever they have time and want to, which makes it a very individual act. Okay, so it's just talking about now communication. Okay, communication has moved from the real world to the virtual world from a spatial point of view. So the difference between the real world and the virtual world is becoming less important in modern society, at least when it comes to communication. So with this in mind, it's not surprising that sports are moving into the digital world. In this way, the question comes up of whether the competition in the virtual world also seems real to the players. Okay, so overall, right, you can see that, again, it's saying it's not surprising, but it's not really saying a judgment. It's not saying it's not for or against. It's kind of showing both. Okay, so the question comes up of whether the competition in the virtual world also seems real to the players, or more generally, how much of a person can tell the difference between the virtual and the real. Psychologists and philosophers, so people who are psychologists, they're interested in the brain, right, and how that works, right? The brain, how your thoughts work. And philosophers are kind of like interested in like the hard questions, answering the hard questions like, why are we here? What is it all for? All those kind of things. Or like ethical questions like, like, is it wrong? Or like, is this truly real? Right? Is playing games truly real? So answering like tricky questions, right, that have a lot of meaning behind them. Okay. So I think we've got enough to answer a couple of these questions. Like, first of all, the first question, what do players in esports refer to themselves? Sportsmen. We can highlight that straight away and move forward on this question. That's the kind of idea of reading a little bit of the questions first. You're investing so that you don't have to take more time later. Okay? You have to read the questions either way at some point. If you read them before, you're just going to be saving yourself the time of having to go back through and read some of these, okay? Or look for some of these. So the main similarity between professional esports and traditional sports, okay? So in terms of the similarity, let's rule out some. So I really suggest with reading comprehension, using a process of elimination, right? Or POE is key. Okay, POE is key. Being able to rule out answers makes sure that you can clear your mind. You're not worried about... Because I'm sure you guys have all seen some questions will have multiple answers that are kind of correct. And you need to work out which one. It can be difficult. So, process of elimination, rule things out. We know that similarity between esports and traditional sports, it's not going to be about good persuasion skills. Okay, you're not persuading in either of these. That was not mentioned. So, both require psychological skills. Yes, that is definitely mentioned throughout the thing. Like the idea of you need to use your brain, you need to use your your motor skills, your cognitive skills as well. Okay, so that's one thing that's mentioned. Paying close attention as well, long periods, making important decisions. These are all things that happen in your brain, right? So that is definitely mentioned as similarities. So that one is good. But again, you've got to use process of elimination, make sure the others are wrong. So both require knowledge about the opponent. Well, again, it's asking us according to the article. So while you may require a lot of knowledge about the opponent, it doesn't really mention knowing the opponent. Okay? So I would say just because it's asking us according to the article what is the main similarity, C is not very good. And physical endurance, well, I think the idea of the esports was that it's not as much, physical endurance. It's more like you might burn a little bit of calories, like they were saying, but it's definitely more the motor skills, the keeping the movements, the cognitive, in your brain basically. So I think overall, psychological skills is referenced more about all the things in your brain. You got to keep on the ball. You got to keep your attention up. You got to make sure you're focusing, that kind of thing. I think that's the main similarity. There is a little bit of physical endurance that they mentioned. They mentioned that they suggest that you could burn more calories during competition. So it could even be you could be keeping fit while gaming, right? But it's definitely not the main similarity. All right, so hopefully that's making sense. Hopefully we are all hashtag crystal clear so far. All right, let me know if you guys are hashtag crystal clear. Okay, we're gonna keep on moving. Question 27. Okay, what is the main argument against? So we already highlighted this because we came through and read the questions. This is going to help us. It was the idea of they're occurring in different worlds in a virtual world, not in the real world. That's the argument against, okay? So it's not that I don't feel tired, because definitely can be very draining, and it even says that you're burning a bit of calories, meaning you kind of are doing some exercise. The players do not burn calories. No. Remember, it literally says they do. The game is not based on point system, though it definitely is based on point system. So it must be D. Based on our process of elimination, competition takes place in virtual spaces. Yeah, so this was the issue here. The idea that it's a virtual world. Right? So that's the answer for the argument against. Let's have a look at an argument for. Okay, so which one is among the main arguments for recognizing esports? So, it requires cardiovascular strength. Oh, very complicated. Cardiovascular strength, that's to deal with your heart. Right, that's to deal with your heart. So, I don't know if I would say that the heart is being mentioned here. Right? I would not say that the heart was mentioned. Did anyone see the heart being mentioned throughout? I didn't see that. Alright, so this is just too specific and it's not mentioned in the article. Again, we need to know according to the article. Okay? Esports are in a competitive setting. Yes, they are, but is that the main reason why they should be considered as real sports? I'm not sure. I don't think that's really the comparison there. Okay, because just being competitive doesn't mean something's a sport. Alright, something can be competitive and not be a sport. That's not really part of the definition of a real sport in this case. Okay? So I think while they definitely both have a competitive setting, it doesn't mean that competitive setting is what makes a sport a sport. Okay? So esports keeps its athletes fit and healthy. I think this one is likely is probably going to be a not as good an answer. Okay? So while this competitive setting is like a good answer, because it's definitely like a comparison being made, we can't say it's like the be all and end all. Okay, but definitely keeping its athletes fit and healthy is a little bit dubious. While you are burning some calories, right? You are burning some calories. I would not say that esports and gaming keeps you fit and healthy because you're not really moving around much. All right, so that one is also Gornsky's. So it actually could end up being B, right? Because B was definitely mentioned, but it's just competitive is not really the only feature of real sports that I think is the main feature because a lot of things can be competitive. All right, now esports need a coach to function. Well, this was not mentioned, so you got to be focusing on things that, like, if they're not mentioned, guys, rule them out. Okay, if it's not mentioned, it can't be the answer. You can't be expected to take your outside knowledge to answer questions, especially when it asks according to the article. So it seems that even though B is not like a perfect answer, it's definitely one of the main arguments for recognizing esports. So I guess it is going to be the correct answer, right? But you can kind of see here, they focus a bit on like the use of, like, you know, the need for all these psychological decisions and like being on the ball, which I think would be a better answer. But if it's not in the answer, then you're just looking for one of the, you know, the reason that applies in the answer. So competitive definitely contributes to it being a real sport, even though it's not the perfect answer. But this proves to us we're just looking, right? Even an answer that isn't perfect, we are just looking for the best answer, not the only answer. Okay, so what this means is we're not looking for like the only perfect answer. We're just looking for the best answer out of the group of answers we have. Alright, so make sure you're understanding that idea. That while I seemed a little bit not sure about this one at first, it can still be the answer. So don't rule answers out that you think are, you know, like possible. Because sometimes an answer might be half right. So keep your options open until you've ruled out the ones that are definitely wrong. Then you can decide. Okay? So let's go forward into question 29. How does the article compare esports to traditional sports? Well, you can see they're definitely focusing more on, so they're not showing just if you think about it, right, they're not just showing the similarities. They're definitely highlighting both the similarities and differences. For instance, so all the similarities I was doing kind of in green and like why they're like the positives of esports in terms of like making them similar to real sports. But the difference was mentioned. There were differences mentioned. The idea of it being in a virtual world, all right, of it being in different worlds, that kind of thing. That was definitely mentioned, and that seemed to be a key factor, right? And so we've got to actually say that there's similarities and differences. We can't just say that there's similarities. So actually option D is going to be our answer for that one. Okay, now coming into the last stretch, last 3 questions. Let's get these done. Question 30. According to the article, what is the effect of technology-mediated communication? So this is towards the end when they're talking about more about communication. Okay, so in this one, it was the idea, right? It makes it harder for people to talk and understand each other at the same time. Okay, because you've got kind of, you know, you've got like some technology that's standing in the way of people just talking to each other. So, question 30. Let's have a look. People can't speak and fully comprehend each other anymore. Yeah. That was mentioned, like it's difficult to comprehend, which is essential in social interactions. Yeah, so A looks good. Again, I'm not going to fully circle A and move on because there could be a better answer. So B, virtual communication makes talking a lot easier and more natural, especially when individuals start to converse in a non-virtual setting. Okay, so it was more so saying, like, the kind of, like, when I was talking about technology, it was kind of saying virtual communication can make things harder. So I would not say it's a lot easier. That one is Gornsky's. Okay, ruled out. Okay? Now C, people become trained in terms of public speaking when they start communicating through. No, we're not being trained for public speaking. This was never mentioned. And if anything, it's kind of saying the reverse. Right? It's saying that it's harder to communicate. Okay? It's basically moved from the real world to the virtual world. Okay? So it's become less important, the difference between the real world and the virtual world. So it's not really about helping you public speaking. And face-to-face social interactions become more personal when it started as a technology-mediated communication. No, definitely not more personal with technology. It's more personal if you're in person with them, talking. Does anyone ever find that sometimes if you're like, you know, if you're emailing someone or texting someone, it just doesn't really feel the same. It doesn't feel the same as being in person and talking to them. So A is the only answer that kind of captures that and saying that it's like, you know, it's difficult to fully speak and comprehend and understand each other. Okay, so that one's the answer is A. Now, the main purpose, alright, so actually first I think it's good to answer the form of the text. We know it's not a narrative and it's not descriptive. It is giving definitely some information, okay? So, now it's between persuasive and informative. Now, if you are writing a persuasive, there's got to be a message running through that you're trying to convince your audience of. However, right, this shows both sides. This text showed both sides. So, it showed similarities and differences, and it didn't really show an opinion. So, informative is a much better answer. Persuasive is when it's trying to persuade you and it's trying to show an opinion. Show an opinion of one side, right? So, when it's trying to show an opinion of one side, that's how you know it's trying to persuade you. Okay? So, now, the main purpose. So, is it a brief history of esports? Not really. It didn't really go through any history aspects, right? It's more so describing kind of like the actual overall, like the differences, the similarities. So, B looks really good because it says to provide analysis of the similarities and differences. That looks really good between professional esports and traditional sports. Okay, good, right? Now, C, to give a first-person perspective of the author's time spent. No, it was not first-person at all, so that one's just silly. That's gone skis instantly. Gone out of our minds. And D, to present a ranking of the top games played in esports competitions. No, none of the games are mentioned. So D is also ruled out. So guys, that is going to bring us, so the answer there is going to be B there, right? Because similarities and differences. So that's going to bring us to the end of the review, guys. Hopefully we learned a thing or two. Remember to kind of have a quick look at the questions beforehand. I'm just highlighting that in. Questions beforehand, just to see any specific answers that you can bring into the text when you're reading through, so you can kind of better answer it as you go through. So overall, make sure you use a process of elimination as well, and don't circle an answer because it's good. Make sure you rule out the others as well. Notice we even had an example where I thought an answer wasn't amazing. I thought there could be a better answer there, right? In terms of the main argument for, in terms of, it requires intense concentration and psychological, abilities, but competitive setting, it still works. So don't rule something out because it's half right. There could still be no other answers. So just make sure you're using a process of elimination, work out which ones are definitely wrong before moving on to the ones that seem like they're right. Okay? So have a great day, guys. Hopefully that has cleared some things up and you guys are feeling like you've learned a thing or two. All the best, and